Hey, it's Alabama Annie, and welcome to part 35 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Lenny was busy working with his dad that afternoon, and they were doing their father's son thing day. So I took a long walk trying to get a grip on my anger and my emotions after my encounter with my aunt and her new fling, and ended up a good way behind the old hotel at the top of the hill where the view was beautiful. I sat under a tree, just listening to the birds and the wind for a while, lost in thought, wondering what I was going to do about Jimmy and how I could get Aunt Mary to believe I wasn't to blame for his advances on me. Then I heard a voice, and I stood up and turned around, looking and listening. It was a woman's voice, shrill and high, singing an old hymn I hadn't heard since I was a little girl, sitting beside my mother in our neighborhood church in Birmingham, Alabama, but I couldn't see where the voice was coming from. I knew the song and heard her sing, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other hath ever known. I sat down again, closing my eyes as I listened, and I recalled the name of that song was In the Garden. The singing stopped, and suddenly the voice called out, "You need to mind that grass you're sitting in. It has stickers in it that will cause you to itch." I jumped up suddenly, looking down at the grass and turning to see where that voice came from, and then there was Effie Jackson, all bent and stooped in a long brown dress and a black shawl that blended her in with the afternoon shadows. Her face was barely visible between the brim of her bonnet as she moved toward me, and I called out, "Hello, Miss Effie." She came to stand beside me and bent down, pulling a sprig of that grass from the ground, holding it up to the sun so I could see. "See the little stickers," she said, pointing to them with a gnarled finger. I looked closely and said, "I do see them." I told her I would be more careful where I sat from then on. "We could sit over there on that hickory log," she said, pointing to the trunk of a very large fallen tree, and I walked over with her. We settled down on the trunk, and she smiled at me and patted me on the knee. "How have you been doing, child?" she asked. "Are you faring well these days?" I told her that everything was all right, but she clucked like a mother hen and said, "No need to whitewash things with me, Maggie. I know you're troubled, and I know it's because you don't feel safe in that old tavern. So, tell me what kind of a creature your aunt has dragged home this time. Is he another one like that old Charlie Teal?" And I told her he was bad, but in another way. And then I told her all about Jimmy and how he was always trying to corner me and put his hands on me. I told her that Aunt Mary said I was being flirtatious. Effie looked at me and clucked again. "She sees your beauty and your youth, and she's jealous of you, Maggie. After all, Aunt Mary's youth left her a long time ago. And there ain't nothing you're doing that's causing this. It's just the old devil in the both of them. You hear me?" she said. "Have you told Miss Hattie or Uncle Jim about what this man is doing? I damn well know they wouldn't stand for it." And I knew she was right. I just hadn't found a way to tell them yet. She stood up and looked at the sun. "Someday soon, Aunt Mary's going to be very unhappy and very sorry for the choices she's made. And then you will be free of all the troubles she brings with those choices. So you just go on and be a good girl and enjoy your life and have fun and do what you're told, and God's going to bless you," she said, looking deep into my eyes. She turned her head to one side and said that she wanted me to listen to her. If I told you that one day you would have to defend yourself against evil, would you believe me? She asked. I told her I hoped that never happened and said I didn't know if I could do it or not. But she said that I could and that I had to pray for the strength to be ready and that I might have to someday take a life to save my own. And I reminded her Jesus said killing was bad, but she said that when the time came, he'd forgive me. Then, before I could ask her anything more or say very much at all about all this talk, she said, "Well, it's time for me to go home. There's a baby due this afternoon, and they'll be coming for me soon. But I'll see you again," she called. She waved goodbye and moved back across the field again into the forest without a backward glance. She seemed to disappear into the edge of the trees. I stood still beside the fallen hickory for a while. Her words had frightened me as I thought of Charlie Teal locked up somewhere again in jail, and I thought of Aunt Mary and the hats and what I suspected about them, and I thought about Jimmy. Now I wondered what lay ahead for me, what kind of a situation I would find myself in that could warrant me ever having to defend myself by taking a life. It was a chilling thought. The next year passed by so quickly I could hardly believe it was already spring. But at the end of the school year, I graduated to high school and the ninth grade with Lenny only a year behind. He had grown out of his boyhood stage and was taller than me with fine features like his dad. He was lanky and tan from working outdoors with Uncle John and Harvey in the garden, and all of the girls at school had their eye on him. He was 13 but looked older and a bit like a young prince, and he was even sprouting peach fuzz on his chin and upper lip. He was very handsome. My friends at school called him Dreamy and made excuses to visit us at the tavern every chance they could in hopes of catching a glimpse of him. At first I found it amusing that they thought Lenny was so cute, and Miss Hattie used to kid me about that. But as time went by, it began to upset me, and the green-eyed monster came out in me. After all, Lenny was not my brother, although up until then we had been like siblings, and I had considered him one, but that summer things took a turn. I had been changing too myself, and the first week of January that year, I got my period. I grew taller and lost some of my baby fat. And over Christmas, Aunt Mary took me shopping and bought me some brassieres and hosiery and let me select some clothing more suitable to my age, and I chose clothing like my friends were wearing. Patterned dresses, skirts, and button-down blouses with saddle Oxford and socks, and also got a couple pairs of dungarees. But I hated the bras. The brassieres rubbed my shoulders, and the snaps at the back pinched my skin, and every chance I got, I took them off. And for the rest of my life, I only wore a brassiere when certain types of clothing dictated. But mainly, I still wore my coveralls and shirts around home, and Aunt Mary no longer tried to dress me in those frilly things she was always buying me before that. One thing was for certain, she couldn't accuse me of dressing seductively any longer. Early summer, the weather was very warm. Lenny and I had gone hiking for the afternoon and to swim for a while in the river. I had worn what I always did to swim, a pair of cut-off dungarees and a short-sleeved shirt, and of course, I was not wearing a bra that day. After we jumped into the cold water and swam for a while, we climbed up onto the bank to sun on the warm rocks. Lenny looked over at me and laughed. He pointed at my shirt and said my headlights were showing. At first, I had no idea what he was talking about, but then I looked down and saw that my nipples were very visible through the wet shirt and tried to pull the shirt away from my skin. I reached out and pinched him on one of his own little man nipples as hard as I could for saying what he'd said. Ouch, he cried, diving toward me, and wrestled with me on the rock as he grabbed my other nipple and pinched it as hard as I had his. Oh, that really hurt, I cried, wriggling away. But then his face was only inches from mine, looking down at me with that smile of his. Something passed between us that never had before as Lenny bent his head down and kissed me on the lips, lingering for a moment before hugging me and letting me go. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered as I shoved him away, but the feel of him on top of me, his touch, and that kiss had awakened something new inside of me that I would never forget. And from that moment on, I knew I loved Lenny, and I thought he was dreamy too, just like all of the other girls at school. But of course, I had secret hopes that one day I would be his wife. Sometimes I'd lie on my bed at night with him in the very next room and I'd imagine that we were married, living in some cozy little bungalow together. And we'd have babies and we'd go to dances and go on romantic hikes in fields of flowers. But my daydreams were shattered in early September, just after Lenny's birthday. It was the night of the high school dance that would be held at the hotel, and it was the first year that we were old enough to attend. And I asked Lenny if he would be my date for the dance, and he agreed. Hattie and I rambled through Aunt Mary's closet and revamped one of her old dresses into a beautiful tea-length gown for me. The dress was a deep rose color with green velvet trim, and I felt very pretty and grown up when I looked at myself in the mirror after I had dressed for the evening, and Hattie had done up my hair, pinning it up from my neck with little clips and placing silk flowers in it. And Aunt Mary sprayed a little perfume on my wrist and gave me some pink lipstick to wear. I wore the pearl necklace and earrings Hattie and Uncle John had given me when I was just a girl, and a pair of fancy little black heels that we bought at the shoe store for me. When I was all dressed, I waited in the parlor for Lenny, who stepped into the room dressed in a new suit and tie his father had bought for him. His shoes were shined, and he smelled like aftershave. He looked very handsome as he offered me the little corsage, and Hattie beamed as she pinned it on my dress. Then Lenny gave me his arm and said, "Ma'am, may we go?" I smiled as we went out the door together. This was like a fairy tale. It was like a part of my daydream. Harvey drove us to the hotel in the car, where we joined our classmates to dance to a live band in the dining room. But sometime after we arrived and had danced through a tune or two, Haley Duffin, the most beautiful girl in our school, started making eyes at Lenny. He was standing with some of the other boys near the punch bowl, but the next thing I knew, he was walking across the room to Haley. I watched as he took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, and my heart sank like a stone. They were slow dancing together as I stood glaring. I glared at them and frowned at them, and she had her head on his shoulder, and his cheek brushed her long blonde hair. And when I saw him kiss her on the neck, I broke into tears, and I ran from the room onto the porch and stood staring out into the darkness, clenching my fists, trying to catch my breath. My eyes burned and I couldn't stop crying. Then several of my friends came out onto the porch. One of the girls asked me if I was all right, and I said I was, but that I wanted her to leave me alone. Then my friend Cindy said, "Did you see the way she was touching him, and did you see him kiss her?" It came out of my mouth before I knew what I was saying. I looked at them and said, "I hate her. I hate Haley Duffin." And then I turned and headed down the stairs and ran off into the darkness for home across the front lawn, through the trees, with them all calling back to me. I burst through the door of the tavern just in time to see Aunt Mary and Jimmy sitting on the sofa kissing. Aunt Mary jumped to her feet as I burst in. I took one look at them and said, "Oh, God, not again." "What's wrong?" she asked, but I jerked free of her and raced on through the dining room and into the kitchen, grateful that Hattie and Uncle John were already gone to bed and wouldn't see me. I went down the hall into my room and threw myself onto my bed, kicking my shoes across the room just as Aunt Mary came through the door. She dodged the left shoe as it flew through the air. She came over to the bed and sat down beside me. "What's wrong with you?" she asked again as I sat up and glared at her. "Haley Duffin is what's wrong. You and your boyfriends, that's what's wrong. And people like Lenny Payne who are always wrong," I screeched as she genuinely tried to comfort me, putting her arm around my shoulder, but I wriggled free and buried my head in the pillow. "Now, Maggie," she said, but I didn't want to hear a word from her or anyone else right then, and I pointed to the door. "Just get out," I cried. "Okay, fine. I try to help you, but if you won't let me vent, I'll leave you alone," she said, slamming the door behind her. I got up and got out of that dress and the silly stockings and flung it all toward the closet, and I put on my pajamas. I turned on the radio, but the same song Lenny and Haley had been dancing to was playing, and I turned the radio off again. I lay across the bed staring at the ceiling, crying my eyes out, and I was still awake when I heard Lenny come in from the dance. He was whistling that same tune. I cried myself to sleep that night, and I had never, ever felt so alone.